some seats for everyone.
So my belief is that it's not a question of if, but when we will have an economic collapse. And it's also my belief that when we have our next economic collapse, that it will be 10 times worse than the Great Depression that we had nearly 100 years ago. So let's jump into why I believe that our next economic collapse will be much worse than the original Great Depression, and let's also talk about some solutions. So at the time of filming this video, our U.S. national debt is over $30 trillion. And let me repeat that, over $30 trillion. And I'm actually afraid to say what that exact number is, because what I'm afraid of is that if things keep going the way they're going, that by the time I film this video and edit it and actually upload it onto YouTube, that by the time I do all that, that the debt will have risen even more. But in just the last year alone, the United States added $2 more trillion to our national debt. And let me repeat that. In just the last year, the last 365 days, the United States has added $2 trillion more to its debt. Not millions, not billions, but trillions of dollars to our national debt. Now, a lot of us in the preparedness community has been saying for quite a long time that our politicians know that eventually, because of the way that they do our economy, that eventually our economy is going to collapse, but that these politicians are just kicking the can down the road so that it'll be a future generation that has to deal with it. But my concern is that this is no longer a can that they're simply kicking down the road. It's growing so big that it's no longer a can, but a much larger drum that they're trying to kick down the road. And we all know that the larger something is, then the harder it is to ignore it or to stop it. So it's not a question of if this house of cards is going to come tumbling down, but again, a question of when. So let's jump into what I find will be the most scariest for us when we do have our next economic collapse. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is that in the first Great Depression, nearly 100 years ago, when the first Great Depression occurred, more people lived in the countryside and fewer people lived in the major cities. Now it's the complete opposite. More people now live in the cities and fewer people live in the country. And what that means is that more people are on top of each other in these crowded cities now than 100 years ago. Now look, I don't have any PhDs, I don't have a master's degree in anything, I'm not the smartest person in the world, but even I know that when things get tight and people are on top of each other, things are going to get ugly. Now, the next thing that concerns me for the next time that we have an economic collapse like the original Great Depression is that people 100 years ago, when they lived out in the countryside, they had more just realistic survival skills. They knew more about how to live off the land. Whereas today, with most people living in the cities, most people have no idea how to grow their own food, how to raise chickens, or anything like that. Heck, even today, most backyard gardeners don't know how to grow a garden where it actually produces food without store-bought fertilizers and having to buy their seeds every year. Really, to put this simply, most people today consider hunting for their food as trying to pick out the best looking piece of produce in the produce aisle of the grocery store. Now, the next thing that concerns me about our next economic collapse is that back then, in the original Great Depression 100 years ago, I think people were more mentally tough back then than what people are now. I think that back then, when hardship hit, people would just kind of suck it up and just forge on and just continue living. But I wonder if in today's climate, with the average guy with his skinny jeans living in a large liberal city, I honestly wonder how he would handle hard times. I honestly think that if hard times hit, a lot of these guys like this, again wearing their skinny jeans and their bean caps and living in this large liberal cities, would just curl up and cry as soon as the times get tough. So what we need to understand is that when times get tough again, that we're going to have a lot of people that's not going to be mentally fit to be able to handle those hard times. Heck, back when I was a uniformed police officer, there was times that I would have to take young adults to the hospital because they were wanting to kill themselves over the fact that they were struggling with a college course, or a girlfriend that they had for 2 months just left them. I mean, the amount of people that were wanting to do a permanent solution for such a temporary problem always really astounded me. So let's talk about the first solution that you can do now to better prepare yourself for an economic collapse when that eventually hits. And the first thing that I would do is put back food as much as you can, and make sure it's the staples such as beans and rice and wheat and flour and pasta and stuff like that. With the way that today's economy is going and the way that inflation is going, that the longer you wait to buy this food, just the more expensive it's probably going to be when you do find yourself having to buy it. But the more food that you can put back now will make it better for you when our next economic collapse happens and you're trying to figure out where your next meal is going to come from. And the next solution that I want to talk about is making sure that you learn or know how to be able to produce your own food. Because knowing how to produce your own food, not only will that help to extend that food storage that you already put back, not only will it help to extend that so it lasts longer, but it will also give you something to eat when that food storage does run out. Now, the next solution that I think is important is having the ability to purify your own drinking water. Now, before you scoff at this, I know how government works, and I know that when people are out of work and they're not paying taxes, then the government has to start trying to cut corners. And then when they start cutting corners to save money, then bad things happen. Think like Flint, Michigan. And my next solution that I think people should consider is having the ability and the knowledge of how to make your own medicine. And again, before you scoff at this, medicine right now is already super expensive. I mean, just look at the cost of basic stuff like cough medicines, cough syrups, and anything like that. So my belief is that when we have another economic collapse and money gets really tight and your child or yourself gets the flu or the cold or something like that, that you're probably not going to have the money to be able to run down to the nearest pharmacy to get that cough syrup or whatever else is needed to help your sick family member or help yourself. For example, take this eastern white pine that's growing on my property here. The Native Americans would use the needles from this eastern white pine to make a tea that would help alleviate coughs for people when they caught the cold or the flu or something like that. Plus, it's also high in vitamin C, which is supposed to help somebody get over the cold or the flu quicker. So my suggestion is to start identifying the plants and the trees and stuff that grow on your property and learn what medicinal uses they may have, and then also learn how to make natural medicines from those trees and shrubs that grow on your property. So that way, when you can't afford cough syrup or other medicines, you know how to make it yourself. And my fifth solution that I think people should consider for preparing for an economic collapse is to make sure that you have an essential job. It's important to remember that when money gets tight, people quit spending money frivolously. So people will quit going to movie theaters, out to restaurants. They will quit taking their dogs to doggy daycares. They'll quit buying expensive coffee from expensive coffee shops, things like that. So I think it would be smart to have yourself in a job where you produce something that people have to live. And then my next solution that I think people should consider is not having debt. And before you click off the video and scoff at this and say, hey, if we have an economic collapse, having debt's not going to matter, we have to remember that in the first Great Depression, the banks were still seizing farms and still seizing homes and making people homeless. So the less debt that you can have when our next economic collapse happens, then I think the better off you will be. I mean, simply put, the more of your items that you actually own, then that cannot be taken away from you when your paychecks dry up in another Great Depression. And my next solution that I think people should consider for preparing for the next economic collapse is getting yourself healthier. Now, before you scoff at that one and click off on the video, you gotta remember that trips to the doctor are expensive. We have to remember that if you go from years of eating horribly and just lying on the couch to suddenly having to do manual labor, that your body's not going to fare too well with that. Again, back when I was a uniformed police officer, it still never ceased to surprise me on how many times I would get dispatched to 50-something-year-old men, young men, 50-something-year-old men that would suddenly die of a heart attack while they were just simply mowing their lawn. And that was just simply because they had 50 years of having McDonald's and fast food all of the time, and then just suddenly now in their 50s going out and doing just a little bit of manual labor like push mowing their lawn. Now myself, I'm not going to be on the cover of Men's Health magazine anytime soon, and I'm not one of those buffest people that's out there, but I don't eat at McDonald's every night. Fast food is a treat for me. But I do get regular exercise, especially here on the property here, and I do try to eat fairly healthy. That way my body can take some stress. So why don't you help this community out? What other tips can you add in that would really help somebody during our next economic collapse? Comment down below with the tips that you think are important. And to learn very scary similarities that are happening today that happened when we had the first Great Depression back in 1929, click on the video that should be appearing on the screen just about now to learn that powerful knowledge. Anyways, folks, this is enough internet for me today. I do need to get back to work here on my property. And folks, if you made it this far, hey, thank you very much for watching. And I pray that you have a good night.